In this video, we'll be talking about the pollen grains or the microspores. The pollen grains or the microspores are the male gametophyte which are present in the flowering plants. And these are actually haploid and uninucleate. That means they are carrying one set of chromosomes and are single nucleated structures. When we talk about the pollen grains or the microspores, they are formed by a process known as microsporogenesis, and this process takes place in the anther. They are produced in large numbers in the anther as a result, and they are found to be present in the pollen sacs. They are stored over there. Now, the pollen grain structure, when we talk, or the shape and the size, these are found to be generally spherical in shape, but they show a lot of variation in the size and shape and the color also. There are various shapes. When you see the pollen grains through a microscope, you will see a lot of variation depending upon the species. The small size of the pollen grains, that is about 25 to 50 micrometers. Their total is 25 to 50 micrometers in diameter, although this is also a range. And the small size of the pollen grains enables it to travel long distances as well. They can be carried easily by the wind. They are light structures because during the process of microsporogenesis, the dehydration has taken place, which causes the microspores formation, and the dehiscence of the anther causes the release of the microspores, and they are light in weight so that it can be carried easily from one to the other place. Coming to the structure of the pollen grains. As we have discussed in the previous video, normally around 60% of the angiosperms they release the pollen grains at two cell stage. That means having one vegetative and one generative cell. But in certain species such as maize, they are released at three cell stage. What do we mean by three cell stage? The three cell stage will have one vegetative cell plus two male gametes. The two male gametes which are being formed over here are formed by the division of the generative cell. The two cell stage will have one vegetative cell and one generative cell, or the male gamete. So, the 60% of the angiosperm have the two cell stage release of pollen grains, whereas a few species have the pollen grain release at three cell stage. When we talk of the structure of the pollen grains are having two layers. That is the outer layer and the inner layer. The outer layer is known as XII. It is a very hard, tough outer layer, and it is made up of a chemical which is known as sporopollenin. Now, this sporopollenin is a proteinaceous layer, and it is produced by the tapetum. Now, this tapetum produces sporopollenin, and this is very much resistant to lot of variations, chemicals, and the surrounding medium. That means it is resistant, and as a result, this property enables the pollen grain to thrive or to survive in various climatic conditions. The second layer followed by the exine is intine. This intine is inside layer, and it is made up of pectin and cellulose. So the chemical composition is pectin and cellulose of the intine. This intine encloses it. Within it is present plasma membrane which contains the cytoplasm of the cells. The cells over here, you can see the pollen cell grain over here. At places, you can see that the exine is not having sporopollen in. Over here you can see these apertures or openings are known as the germ pores. And the germ pores is area where the sporopollen is absent, and it is the site from where the pollen tube comes out from the pollen grain. And this pollen tube will eventually be carrying the male gamete to the female gamete to bring about the fertilization. So the germ cells which are present at places within this will allow the pollen tube to come out from these places. So the exine, outer exine, this show a lot of variations in structure, like the composition over here and the different kind of structures which are being formed, the spikes which you see is exine layer. Inside the plasma membrane of the intine, we find there are two cells, that is, one is vegetative cell and the other is generative cell. The vegetative cell is larger in size and it has lot of food material, that is, it has reserved food material, and the nucleus which is present, that is the peculiar thing, the nucleus which is present over here is irregular in shape. Normally it is spindle shape, it is irregular in shape. The vegetative cell provides nutrition later on. Also, this is known as the tube cell. The vegetative cell is also called as the tube cell. The reason being, the tube, the pollen tube which is formed when the pollen grain lands onto the stigma, the vegetative cell will cause the formation of the pollen tube. Therefore, we also call it as a tube cell. The tube cell will be carrying the male gamete. The last is the generative cell. It is smaller in size and it is normally the nucleus is suspended freely within the cytoplasm of the vegetative cell. So the complete structure of the pollen grain consists of exine, intine, the germ pores, the vegetative cell and the generative cell. When we talk of the pollen grains, they are the male gametes that has to reach to the female stigma or the female reproductive part to bring about the fusion. Now, when we talk of pollen grains, there are certain terms which you should be familiar with. That is, one is pollen viability. What is meant by pollen viability? Pollen viability means the capacity of the pollen grain to live, grow and germinate. So that is what is meant by pollen viability. Now, this pollen viability varies greatly, and in certain species it can last only for few days, and in certain species such as Solanaceae family and the Leguminosae family, it can extend for months. So the pollen viability varies in different species of plants, and it is important because this pollen viability enables us to store the pollen for a certain period of time, after which they will become non-viable. That means they will not be able to germinate, and by germination we mean the formation of the pollen tube. The another term which is very important is cryopreservation. Cryopreservation is the storing of the pollen grains at minus 196 degrees Celsius in liquid nitrogen, and they form the pollen banks. So what is done over here is actually due to the peculiar property since of the pollen grains having the sporopollen, which is resistant to most of the chemicals, the pollen grains of several species of plants can be preserved in liquid nitrogen at minus 196 degrees Celsius, and the pollen banks are there which keep these pollen grains. Now they are important for maintaining or keeping a track or keeping a record of the pollen grains. We can preserve actually. Then the pollen allergy. Pollen allergy is allergy which is or the allergic reaction to certain species of pollen. Many people are allergic to pollen grains, certain specific pollen grains, and these are actually due to the various chemical composition which the pollen grains are made up of, and they cause when they are taken in by the with the dust, or when they are taken up by the people during the breathing, they cause allergy in certain people. This is what is known as pollen allergy. One very good example is Parthenium, or another is carrot grass, which were actually they came as a contaminant along with the wheat, which was imported from outside, and as a result, the Parthenium and carrot grass grew widely in different areas of the country, and they released the grains, pollen grains, which were causing allergies in several people. Then we have another term, that is pollen supplements. Supplements are, when we talk, supplements are any additional food items which increase your immunity or your inner capability of the body, apart from taking the normal food. So we have different kinds of supplements, but since pollen grains are very rich in nutrients, especially the proteins, they are consumed by the athletes and other people, so as to as a supplement. So the pollen grains are also used as supplements in by various athletes and other people. So the structure of the pollen grain and the various properties, the entire structure and the stage at which the pollen grains are released, I hope you are able to understand. Thank you.